Right, there we go. So our next presenter is Aya Mitani from the University of Toronto. Aya is going to talk about reproducible, reliable, replicable in-class exercise using peer-reviewed studies. And so thank you very much, Aya.
Thank you. And me. Okay. I believe you can see that.
Yeah, perfect.
And you see it moving. Okay. I'm just going to, there you go. Okay. So today I want to talk about my experience in implementing an in-class reproducibility exercise in a somewhat traditional biostatistics graduate course. And I'm going to share some of my challenges that I faced when I was making this exercise and preparing this exercise, and my plans for next time, and some new thoughts I have on reproducible research based on this experience. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the background of the course. It's called Analysis of Correlated Data, and it's listed as a biostatistics course at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. I have about 15 students enrolled in the course with a few auditors. And it's mostly comprised of biostatistics masters and PhD students, some from EPI, some from the Health Policy Management and Evaluation Department, and some from schools of medicine and pharmacy. And I've taught this course last year too, and this year, both times it's been offered online. And we meet weekly for 3 hours, and it's a lecture style course. And I embed a lot of R code in my slides and notes, and I also have breakout sessions for group exercises here and there, and we use R Markdown for homework. So, of course, after taking this course, I want the students to be able to identify sources of correlation and be able to know what kind of model to fit based on what kind of data they have, yada, yada, yada. But also, I want the students to be able to read a scientific paper that analyzed correlated data and really understand what was done. And I also want the students to be able to write a scientific paper that analyzed correlated data in a comprehensible way. So I thought to do a reproducibility exercise where we use data from a real study where we can sort of connect the textbook problems to real application. But of course, like in creating any sort of assessment, assignment, course material, I faced challenges in creating this reproducibility exercise. And I'm going to talk more about each of these challenges in more detail. But the first was finding a study with accessible data. Second was pre-processing data into an analytical format. Third was reproducing the actual analysis, so reproducing the tables and figures in the paper. And also implementing the exercise in class, so how I was going to do that in an online environment. And also replicating the analysis to new data. So the first challenge was in finding a study with accessible data, and I had a few requirements. The topic had to be in health sciences because we're a school of public health. So that means that the data had to be clinical data. And also I wanted to have continuous outcome because up to that point, we were focusing on models for continuous outcome. And data had to have some kind of a correlation. So I was looking for a longitudinal study or a multi-level study with like clustering within hospitals or schools or something like that. So I relied on PLUS Medicine because of its reputation and scope and the data availability statement that they have. So they require authors to make all data necessary to replicate their studies findings publicly available without restriction at the time of publication. So this sounded very promising. So using their advanced search tool, I wanted to find a longitudinal study that was published fairly recently, so between years 2018 and 2021. And I also wanted to find a study that used linear mixed effects model. So I wanted the body of the paper to have the phrase random effects. And interestingly, these, what I thought were pretty broad and general search terms, only returned 8 articles, but that's okay. So I went through each of these articles, data availability statement, hoping to find a nice paper with an interesting data that was publicly available. So I came across a data availability statement like this. All relevant data are within the paper, which I don't know what that means. There was no data available in the paper. There was no supplementary material that included data, no URL, anything like that. So very vague. There was also, this was a very common data availability type of availability statement I came across. You can apply for access to anonymized study data, but any cross-border transfer of individual data must obtain official approval following legal procedures. So this data came from China and war in Canada, so it didn't really seem feasible I didn't want to go through any legal procedures just to create a assignment for the teaching assignment. And then there was this statement, all relevant data are on this repository at these URLs. And I actually did make an account and requested the data. And eventually I received the data, but 2 months after, or maybe maybe it was like 3 months after even. So it wasn't in time to create the assignment. Maybe I'll use it next year, we'll see. And then this is sort of like a classical statement that data cannot be shared publicly because of ethical reasons. And researchers who meet specific criteria set in the relevant ethics approval can maybe obtain the data. And I don't think I met this specific criteria. So on to the next one, which said that part of the data was available in the appendix and the other part of the data was available on GitHub. So anytime you see the word GitHub, sounds very promising, right? So this paper was titled the Social Distancing to Slow the US COVID-19 Epidemic Longitudinal Pre-Test Post-Test Comparison Study. And it was published in August 2020. And notice that they still call this an epidemic and not a pandemic. So it kind of speaks to how early this study was published. But it was published by a group of researchers at Harvard and Mass General, and my former postdoc advisor was a co-author too. So it sounded very promising, and it met all of my criteria. So it was definitely, the topic is in health sciences and it's in clinical data, or it's aggregated data, but it's still data on people. And the outcome was state level rate of change. And the authors used so this was treated as a continuous outcome, and it's a longitudinal study, and the authors used a linear mixed effects model with random intercept. So great. And briefly, they wanted to study if the implementation of statewide social distancing measures, such as like school closures or work closures, cancellation of public events, had an effect on reducing daily COVID cases early during the pandemic. And the model that they used was a linear mixed effects model. And the outcome was defined as the rate of change in cases on day J in state I. And the implementation period they used implementation period day as fixed effects and state as a random effect. And day 0 is the date that the first public health measures were implemented for each state. And pre-implementation period was defined as days between 2 weeks prior to day 0 and day 4 to allow for some lag effect. And post-implementation period was defined as the period between day 4 and 3 weeks after implementation. And they found that case growth rate declined by 1% per day after implementing state-level public health measures. So then on to the second challenge, which was pre-processing the raw data sources into an analytical format. So the paper had listed 2 data sources in their data availability statement. And one was the New York Times COVID data repository on GitHub. And I'm sure some of you in the audience have accessed this data before. The link is here, and the data for the state level cases are in a nice CSV format. And the other data source was something that the authors themselves had compiled using news outlets and media for the dates that the social distancing measures took place for each state. And interestingly, they gave this data set in their supplementary material, which was created in Microsoft Word. So this table is in a Word document, which I had to copy and paste it into Excel and did a little bit of arranging to make it into a CSV file. So there were more pre-processing to do. I had to merge the 2 data sets and restrict the data by the date range that the authors used. I had to create the outcome, which was state level rate of change in COVID-19 cases, and of course the exposure variables as well. I'm only showing a few lines of R code here, but the actual R script that used to create the analytical data is much, much longer. And before I give this exercise to the students, I had to make sure that I could reproduce the results, but even a seemingly thoroughly written paper lacks some details. So my first attempt in recreating this figure failed miserably. And I had to go through several iterations of tweaking my code to reflect the subtlety of scientific writing when describing the analysis that was used. So the next challenge was in deciding how to actually implement this exercise during class. As a pre-class assignment, I asked the students to read the paper and answer some of these preliminary questions. What was the research question? How was the primary outcome defined? How was the primary exposure defined? And I asked the student to actually write down the model equation they used in the primary analysis of the paper. And this was actually a very telling for me. I learned a lot about how the students interpret word into math. And in the text of the paper, the authors say we fitted a mixed effects linear regression model specifying the log difference in daily cases as the outcome of interest and including a random effect for state to allow for within state correlation of cases over time. And what I learned is that this phrase random effect for state is actually pretty confusing. Because the authors don't specify what kind of random effect this was. In textbook, when they describe the model, they would specify a random intercept for something or a random slope for something. But you see a lot of these sort of vague description of random effect in scientific papers. And also, this was a longitudinal study, so I think many of the students expected a random slope in the model as well. But this random effect for state was actually a random intercept. So this sort of asking the students these preliminary questions was a very good indicator of how well I was teaching the material in the course as well. And also the last question, what was the date range used in the primary analysis? Okay. So I used the Learn R package to create the exercise, and I had the interface on screen, and everybody was encouraged to follow along on their own machine. And so I had cleaned up the raw data sets a bit, but still I wanted the students to go through the merging process and creating the necessary variables. So I gave them instructions throughout the document and started writing the code. And also I had like the solution to the code available. And I also had some multiple choice questions throughout. And I couldn't really tell how many students were actually writing their own code or if they were just watching me write the code. But so, because this was an online environment, but writing code is essential in any biostatistics course. But the objective of this exercise was to understand the process of arriving at the final data and how the analysis was performed. So I wasn't too concerned if they were just if they weren't writing the code fast enough. But in the end, I don't know if the actual LearnR environment was necessary for this particular exercise. Big reason is the R object created in one chunk doesn't pass on to the next chunk. So if you're creating like an analytical data in one chunk, then you'd have to like save it into your environment and then in the next chunk load it. So it was a little bit, there were all these like unnecessary extra steps that we had to do. So I think next time I'll just use a regular R interface to do it. But it was a good excuse for me to learn the package. And yeah, and then we fit the model together and compared the coefficients that we got to the actual paper, and they were surprisingly close in the end after I did a bunch of pre-work, of course. And we also reproduced the figure together. And the last challenge was in applying this analysis to Canadian data, so replicating the analysis to another data set. So I made a post-class assignment where I asked the students to apply the same analysis to data from 6 provinces in Canada. And COVID-19 case counts are publicly available, so that was great. And I did a little bit of quick Google search to obtain the first dates of province-wide social distancing implementation, and that was easy because I only focused. There are fewer provinces in Canada than states in the U.S. But of course, the same analysis that was conducted in the US can't necessarily carry over to Canadian data, mostly because the case counts in Canada were much lower. So I had to restrict to the most populous provinces. So that's why we only looked at these 6 provinces in Canada. And then I also had to use a 5-day rolling average because some provinces had case counts of 0 in the middle of this date range. And there was also little provincial variation in dates of implementation. All provinces implemented social distancing measures between March 13th and March 20th. So it didn't really affect the model, but it was in the US, the earliest was March 10th in Washington, and the latest was in March 25th in Idaho. So there was a little bit of more interesting discussion that we could have fit, around the US data, not much in the Canadian data at this time in the pandemic. And this question I asked the students, how would you analyze Canadian data to answer the same questions, was I think a very good question to ask. So I think students were able to really think about how they would analyze real data. So some common answers were actually to include a random slope because of the differences in population across province, include some weights for size of province, or like some kind of use population as a covariate or something. But I think including a random effect for province kind of takes care of that in some way. Anyway, another student proposed to use time series analysis, and another student actually proposed to use ordinal public health measures instead of just the first public health measure, yes or no. these public health measures are sort of layered protections, right? So, was there school closure and also work closure? What else, like border restriction? So not just binary, but multiple categories of public health measures. Oops. Okay. So I did get some feedback from students, and here are the results. A lot of the students enjoyed the topic of the paper. So COVID-19, data is a very popular topic, I guess. And a lot of the students also enjoyed pre-processing the data and also replicating the analysis using Canadian data. Not many students enjoyed the actual finding the data source. I don't think nobody enjoys that. And I guess the learn art environment was a split between enjoy, not enjoy. I also asked what they would want to focus more on if we do this kind of a exercise again. And a lot of the students wanted to focus on, the fitting the actual model and discussion on why authors chose this particular method to analyze the data. And actually interpreting the model was another popular feedback. Obtaining the raw data was sort of at the bottom. Critiquing the paper wasn't a very popular topic to focus on. Most students thought the pre-class assignment was helpful, and many of them wanted to do this again. Three students never wanted to do this again in the class. But I thought this was an interesting answer I got. So only 2 students said that they have done this kind of a reproducibility exercise in another class. So that's something to think about. Okay, so some thoughts on preparing in-class reproducibility exercise. You definitely need to prepare in advance. It does take a long time to actually find the right study and find the right study that has the correct data or the right data sources, and also the actual reproducing task does take up a lot of time. And I thought the pre-class assignment was important. So, asking the student to actually read the paper and having them answer the preliminary questions will, force them to read the paper very carefully. And next time, I think I'll focus more on the analysis and less on pre-processing the data. So I'll probably do more of the pre-processing myself and give the students like a more the data that's closer to the analytical format. And next time I'm going to focus more on model interpretation. So not just sort of trying to interpret the model that we reproduce, but also how the authors are interpreting the model in their results section as well. And this exercise was definitely a good way to gauge students' understanding of the topic. And I think it's a good a good sort of platform for teach students that it's okay to disagree with published papers, because the peer review system is not perfect, and just because the paper was published, you don't have to agree with everything the authors did. And I'm kind of debating whether or not to make this into a group exercise. I think it'll be hard to do if the students had to do a lot of the pre-processing the data, but if they were given data that was close to the analytical form, then maybe this is a nice way to do some group exercise. So some final thoughts I have on reproducibility in general. If raw data is available, then why not the analytical data? So in my example, the authors provided the raw data sources, but obviously many additional steps were taken to arrive at the actual data that was used to fit the model. And I don't see any harm in providing that data as well. So it's good, and it's also great to see more and more journals requiring data availability statement, which probably encourages or incentivizes the authors to provide data. But I like this quote a lot. So your research is the full software environment, code, and data that produce the results. And data is great, but any data comes with code to analyze it. So I think we should also encourage the authors to provide data and code as well. And I think we have to keep in mind that just because you can reproduce the research, it doesn't mean that the research is reliable. But how will we know if a study is reliable if we can't reproduce it? So I like to think that an ideal study is like reproducible, reliable, and replicable. And I try to imagine someone else trying to reproduce my analysis whenever I write a paper, and I want that person to be successful. And it would be great if there was an internal reproducibility peer review system where like a colleague or a student attempts to reproduce my results before I submit my paper to a journal. But really, who has time to do that unless we really make this into a norm in our field? I'm sure this kind of system has been discussed during this workshop and has been implemented by many others, many of you. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well. And I think that's all I have to say. So thank you very much. Those are my contact information. Yeah, so happy to hear from you if we have time left. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you for a really wonderful presentation. The adult left the room, so I'm in charge for the short term. If anybody has questions, maybe raise your hand. How do I even? Oh, that's very convenient. Shannon, go ahead.
Thanks so much for a great talk. My question is from like a purely selfish perspective. I've taught a similar exercise. And you may have covered this at the beginning and I just missed it, but I'm curious how much time you spent in class versus what was done on their own. And like, where did you get hung up with students taking way longer than you anticipated in an exercise like this? I'm just curious if our experiences overlap, and I'm trying to improve mine. So I'm trying to steal ideas from you.
Yeah, so we spent 3 hours in class doing this, and I was sharing my screen. I was like doing everything with them, and I knew the code that I was going to use. So, and there were actually, and students did, raise their hand or speak up whenever they had some issues. Yeah, and I also had the solution to all the code that were supposed to be written. So students were able to look at the solution if they were hung up on how they would, on writing any sort of code. I didn't mention this, but I did have a bunch of discussion points prepared at the end of the class, but we didn't have enough time to go over them. So I think next time I would, I would cut back on some of the data pre-processing, because I feel like that's less important than actually fitting the model and trying to interpret it and all that. And the pre-class assignment was, in this course, I do give weekly homework. So it was one of the weekly homework. So the students were given the homework a week in advance. And the post-class assignment too was the homework that was going to be due the week after.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
That's great. Are there any other questions? Oh, Lee, go right ahead.
Hi, great talk. Just a quick question. You mentioned that people often will give their open data, but not give their analytical processes. You said it wouldn't cause too much of a problem. So why do you think that is? Is it proprietary? They don't want people focusing on their processes. They want to focus on more the results of their work.
Yeah, I think it may just be that it's not part of the practice. I feel like in a paper that's focused more on statistical methods, more and more people are sharing their code because that's actually the research that they want to disseminate, right? But I think in an applied paper, the focus, yeah, like you said, the focus is probably more on the results and not really like how the data was analyzed, maybe. And perhaps a lot of people think that, you know, writing that process in English is good enough to convey what was done. But that's definitely not the case. Like, you know, if you've ever tried to reproduce any analysis that was done in a paper, you often find that what's written in the paper doesn't really translate to what's being done in a script. So I don't know. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on this.
Well, I can attest to Rohan observing me making mistakes in every production process, so there is some truth to that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel like we need a U of T. We need to have like a little group, just one day session, everyone sharing how they're doing these reproducibility things, because there's a few of us, and it'd be great to, I mean, I've just learned so much from your presentation that I'm going to copy. Jay?
I just wanted to ask if Aya would be willing to sort of participate in this little mini reproducibility workshop we're having for literally the exact same thing that you're doing, having students try to reproduce results. It's in, I forgot now, it's May, correct? If you're interested, then we'll try to get you information. It's
Yes.
a really cool paper, much more structured than I have in mind currently, but I really enjoyed it.
Okay, yes, please. I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so 10 May, the idea is that everyone, we bring our champions. So Jay's going to have a few from his class. I'm going to have a few from my class, and Ben is also going to have a few from his class. And the students are going to go through what they did. So maybe you could have a few of your champions.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
DSI is going to support it, so we should be able to get some.
Okay.
Are there any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we might move on to Shannon. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate your presentation. It's just fantastic.